Hey guys, tonight we take a slow moonlit walk into the shadowy alleys of medieval Europe, where behind creaking wooden doors and flickering lanterns, an entire parallel society hums with whispers, laughter, perfume and secrets. The air is damp, thick with candle smoke and the tang of wine-soaked breath. Somewhere down the corridor, a lute twangs off-key, a woman laughs, then someone slams a door. You pause. The townsfolk won't talk about what goes on here, not openly, but you're about to find out. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late, but not quite late enough for the respectable world to sleep. Behind shuttered windows, people murmur about sin and salvation, but on this street, things are far more honest. The red lantern sways above a low-beamed doorway. No, not red in a neon modern way, but literally a lantern with a coloured pane or oiled silk dyed crimson, signalling that pleasure is sold here. And no, you're not in some lawless backwater. In many towns, these places operate under full royal and religious blessing. More on that. Inside, the brothel is smaller than you imagined. One narrow hall, 3 rooms on the first floor, a wooden stairway warped and creaking like it might betray you at any moment. And that smell? A cocktail of lavender oil, tallow candles, musty linens and cheap ale. You're starting to get it. This place isn't about fantasy, it's about survival wrapped in satin. The women, and occasionally men inside, greet you with bored glances, their bodies dressed in strategically bright fabrics, orange, pink, ochre, colours forbidden to good wives, but standard issue here. One of them wears bells on her wrist, another smokes something pungent from a curled pipe, one lounges barefoot, toes painted with crushed berries. They're not ashamed, they're working. Contrary to what you might expect, these brothels are not some underground lair of outlaws. Nope, many were state-sanctioned, even regulated. In Paris, London, Florence and Vienna, officials literally drew up lists of approved houses, sometimes publishing the names of workers in city logs. There were permits, inspections, and yes, rent paid to the church. More on that spicy little contradiction next section. Right now you're just absorbing the atmosphere, the hum of distant music, muffled moans, a dice game in the back, a pair of boots tumble from an upstairs room, someone laughs. It's not all grim, and it's not all glamorous. It's just life, concentrated into one candlelit pressure cooker of desire, desperation, and dirty jokes. Outside, the town guard strolls by, tapping his halberd on the stones. He doesn't look twice. He knows this house is legal. He also knows he'll probably be back later in plain clothes. Here's a quirky detail: in some towns, brothels were required to close on holy days. But instead of obeying, madams simply moved the party upstairs, locked the front door, and snuck in the regulars through the back. Historians still argue whether local officials truly cared, or were just enjoying the game of pretend. The brothel is a crossroads, a rumor hub, a social detox chamber. Travelers, soldiers, bakers and scribes alike all funnel in, and you're the observer, the quiet one in the corner, nursing a lukewarm drink and soaking it all in. Don't worry, they won't ask you to participate. You're here to witness. Now listen. Above the laughter, there's a woman's voice telling a story. Something about a knight who paid in foreign coins and forgot his helmet. Another talks about a customer who cried after 3 minutes, then asked to be held. There's tenderness here. There's also cruelty. One woman points to a fading bruise on her shoulder and shrugs. Better than starving, she mutters. The door creaks again. A monk walks in. You'd be surprised how often that happened. Some came to preach, some came to weep, some came to do both, with their robes hitched and shame packed neatly away in their satchels. Threadbare curtains, a carved Virgin Mary statue oddly tucked in a corner, and a calendar marking paydays with tiny stars. In one corner, a cracked mirror hangs crookedly above a bowl of rosewater and a comb. And yes, business is booming. This is not a slow night. You realize something else. No one is pretending. The laughter isn't always fake. The flirtation isn't always forced. And the weariness isn't hidden. It's worn like jewelry. You're not in some fairy tale tavern. You're in a place where medieval economics, religion and bodily autonomy collide in chaotic, candlelit ways. So as you finish your drink and head toward the back staircase, don't trip on that loose board. you're not just exploring a building, you're stepping into a deeper understanding of how the medieval world navigated pleasure, poverty, power, and punishment. Welcome to the Red Lantern District. You probably won't survive this century with your modern moral compass intact, but that's okay. You climb the narrow staircase, hand trailing the wall for balance. The wood is slick from centuries of oil and touch. As you reach the top, the hallway narrows. There's a tapestry trying to look expensive. It's not. A moth flutters out of it. And down the corridor, you hear laughter again, followed by what sounds suspiciously like a prayer. Not whispered in guilt, but chanted openly. Here's the twist. Medieval brothels weren't always dark corners hiding from righteous eyes. In many cities they were entirely legal. And not only legal, they were, get this, regulated by the very powers that preached chastity and piety. You step into a small chamber at the end of the hallway. The windows cracked open, letting in the smell of chimney smoke and damp hay. Below you, the street is quiet, but inside, the world buzzes with contradictions. Let's start in 13th century Paris, where municipal officials created zones of tolerance, literally called clapières, or rabbit warrens for sex work. In London, areas like Southwark housed stew houses, named after their bathhouse origins. Stews were originally for bathing, but surprise, naked people in hot water tend to have ideas. Eventually, the church tried to separate the stews from the sin, but failed spectacularly. Now, here's where it gets deliciously ironic. The church, which thundered about purity from the pulpit, often owned the land these brothels operated on. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy for much of the 14th century, brothels literally paid rent to the church. You could imagine some poor monk hunched over the ledgers, writing payment from House of Lilies, 2 florins and 1 goose. Was this hypocrisy? Some say yes. Others argue it was practical governance. After all, officials reasoned, men will sin better to contain it, tax it, and monitor it. Historians still argue whether this was moral flexibility or sheer economic opportunism. In many cases, rules were drawn up. Brothels had to be a certain distance from churches, or noble homes, had to close on feast days, good luck enforcing that, and weren't allowed to employ respectable women, which really just meant married or upper class. You could work there if you were poor, foreign, or desperate, but heaven help you if you were someone's daughter of note. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this. Sex was sinful, yes, but necessary. Like sewage, it had to go somewhere. So the brothel became the moral septic tank of the city, absorbing vice so the rest of the town could feel clean. You might say the clergy outsourced temptation like a bad habit. Back in your brothel, a woman in her late 30s, not old, but older than most here, hands you a steaming mug of mead, and gestures for you to sit on a stool near the hearth. Waiting for the priest, she smirks. You blink. Oh, he comes Thursdays. Confession then cuddle. You choke on the mead. She laughs. Don't worry, she adds. He's not a hypocrite. He just knows where the forgiveness is needed most. One quirky tale. In the German city of Nuremberg, a madam once petitioned the city council to send her more clean men, because too many of her regulars were bringing in lice. The council responded by hiring a public bathhouse steward to inspect the men before entry. Imagine that interview process. And in Florence, a brothel once applied for city funding during a festival, because they argued their services counted as morale boosting. Shockingly, the council approved it. Florence knew how to party. Back in your brothel, you notice a leather-bound ledger on a small writing desk. The ink is smudged, but legible. Names, dates, initials, fees. One column labeled simply tithe. That's right, the brothel paid its dues to the church just like any other business. God's work, apparently, had many forms. You glance out the window again. Across the street, a chapel bell tolls the hour. The timing is too perfect. Downstairs, the music begins again. This time slower, almost reverent. The woman next to you hums along. It's a hymn. You start to notice this isn't a place that hides from fate. It coexists with it, in a tense truce. There's a crucifix on the wall, nailed slightly crooked. A tiny saint's medal tucked behind a mirror. One girl crosses herself before opening the door for a new guest. This is not a place where people forget God. It's a place where they negotiate with him. Of course, not everyone was so relaxed. Reformers like Saint Bernardino of Siena railed against these institutions, demanding closure and punishment. But for every Bernardino, There was a city councillor clutching a purse full of brothel taxes, reluctant to let go of that revenue stream. Historians still debate how much the average medieval person accepted the brothel. Was it just tolerated, quietly respected, publicly shamed, but privately visited? The answer seems to be yes, all of the above. A younger woman passes you trailing a scent of roses and something sharper, vinegar, maybe. She's humming, wearing a chemise that slips off one shoulder like it was designed to do exactly that. She pauses, sees you watching, and smirks. You're new, you nod. She leans closer. Don't worry, they all start like that. Give it a week, you'll stop flinching every time someone says forgiveness. Then she's gone, vanishing down the stairway. The older woman refills your mug. Heard the bishop might raise the rent next month, she says. Guess we'll have to offer confessional discounts. You both laugh quietly, but not cruelly. There's a strange peace here. It's not born of safety, it's born of accept. These people know their place in the system. They know they're needed and scorned in equal measure, and they know that every coin they earn whispers through the walls of churches, palaces, and guild halls. Even saints need taxes after all. As the fire crackles low, and the sounds of the night resume below, you begin to understand. The brothel was never just a dirty secret. It was a cornerstone of the medieval city, part theatre, part prison, part temple, and above all, a business. You're back downstairs now, leaning against the archway of the main room. The candles have burned lower, and the air is thicker. Mead, sweat, perfume, and stories. But before you even notice the girls or the guests tonight, your eyes are drawn to her. She's sitting behind a table that doubles as an office desk, and a bar counter, one boot propped up on a low stool, quill in hand, brows furrowed. The madam. And make no mistake, she runs this place. You probably imagined some shadowy male figure calling the shots, didn't you? But in most medieval brothels, it was women, usually older, sharper, and far more organized than their clients, who held the keys. She doesn't look at you yet. She's doing math. Quick, efficient, pen-scratching math. Tallies of bed usage, candle purchases, beer deliveries, wages, bribes. A mistake here doesn't mean a stern email. It could mean jail, or worse. You glance at her ledger. It's an intimidating sight. Names coded by initials, strange symbols marking special services, little circles indicating repeat customers. Next to one, a skull. You decide not to ask. Madams or bordelier, tenancier, stew holders, depending on your region, were businesswomen first and foremost. Many were former workers themselves, having aged out of the trade, but not out of the game. Others were widows or women kicked out of respectable society, who found success in the one place that didn't care about a scandalous past. And here's something that might surprise you. Some were rich, like property-owning, tax-paying, politically connected rich. In Bruges records show madams who bought multiple buildings and even lent money to minor nobles. In London, a well-known madam named Alice Wade was brought to court, not for running a brothel. Everyone knew she did that, but because a jealous merchant accused her of undercutting his load, she ran a financial side hustle. The woman in front of you finally looks up. Her eyes are tired, but there's steel behind them. She nods at you, not unkindly, just with the air of someone who's seen enough nonsense to last 6 lifetimes. Looking for work? She asks flatly. You shake your head. She shrugs. Suit yourself. Let me know if you change your mind. We've got an opening. One of the girls eloped with a minstrel. Again. Now here's a juicy tidbit. In Venice, madams were required to wear a yellow veil. Yes, mandatory fashion, so they could be recognized in public, ostensibly to shame them, but in reality, it gave them celebrity status. People would whisper as they passed by, and some even asked for advice. These women knew things. You don't run a brothel in the middle of a religious city-state without becoming part therapist, part priest, part crime boss. But this power didn't come without pressure. The madam had to manage the moods of the workers, ensuring safety, preventing fights, spotting illness before it spread. She also had to manage customers, a violent noble, diffuse the situation, a drunk bishop, get his money before he passes out, a poor man pretending to be rich, extract the coin or kick him out quickly, before he ruins the illusion for everyone else. And let's not forget the neighbors. The madam you're watching now sends a bottle of spiced wine across the street every week, to the local baker's wife, just to keep complaints at bay. One time, a customer vomited in the baker's doorway, and the madam sent over 2 girls to clean it up while singing hymns. PR, medieval style. Historians still argue, she mutters aloud to no one in particular, whether I run a brothel or a boarding school. Then she smirks at you. The answer's yes. You don't laugh this time. You're still absorbing the truth. The madam's power was precarious. If she fell out of favor with city officials, she'd be shut down. If one of her girls died mysteriously, she could be held responsible, and if she made too much money. Suddenly the taxmen got curious. In Frankfurt, one madam was so successful that she built an extension onto her building, and the local guild took her to court for expanding without permission. She won the case, then hosted a party with jugglers and free wine for the whole neighborhood. Petty revenge in perfect velvet. But not all stories end in success. Many madams were scapegoated during moral panics. If a plague broke out, it was often the women of the stews who were blamed for divine wrath. In London during the Black Death, brothels were shuttered under the assumption that sin had drawn the disease into the city. Spoiler, it was probably the rats. Still, most of the time, the city needed these women too much to cut them off completely. The taxes, the housing, the ability to funnel all the naughtiness into a single, controllable zone. It was just too convenient. So madams learned to walk the line, charm the clerics, bribe the guards, deliver clean sheets to the mayor's cousin. Whatever it took, the woman behind the counter slams her ledger shut. Another day's math done. She stretches, then calls out toward the back. Marta, don't forget to count the candles this time. We're short again. A muffled "I did count them" comes from upstairs. Then one of you is sneaking them to the alchemist again. I know he's not just buying them for potions. She rolls her eyes and turns to you. Honestly, you try running a house of sin and get robbed blind by candle theft. You grin despite yourself. She reaches under the counter and pulls out a tiny bell. It's dented but polished. This, she says, is my real power. Ring it once, wine appears. Twice, backup arrives. 3 times. She narrows her eyes. They all vanish. Don't ask why. You nod, slowly. She chuckles and places it back. Now you get it. She's not here just for the business. She's the spine of this strange little ecosystem. Without her, the rooms don't run, the doors don't open, and the girls don't eat. She may not be the saint you imagined, but she's keeping the whole chaotic enterprise from collapsing into dust and fistfights. And as she stands, stretching her back with a groan, you see a small tattoo on her wrist. A crescent moon. Maybe it means something. Maybe it's just fashion. But it reminds you this woman lived a whole life before she got here, and she'll keep living it long after tonight's wine is gone. You're sitting now in the main hall, pressed into a cushioned bench that's seen better centuries. The room has changed. Not the furniture. Same rickety tables, same candle-choked sconces. But the vibe. You expected moaning and murmurs. But instead, there's music. A lute strumming clumsily. A woman in a coppery green gown steps into the center of the room, twirling, laughing, not provocatively, just joyfully, like she's trying to conjure spring in the middle of a plague. And the crowd, they're clapping. This isn't just a brothel. It's a venue. You've seen the girls lean against doorways. Sure, but here they're also singing bawdy tunes, telling jokes, and believe it or not, debating politics. One woman just told a poem about a knight with steel armor and a soft heart, and the baker's apprentice next to you nearly cried into his soup. Because here's the secret no one tells you: medieval brothels weren't only sex factories. Many were cabarets of sorts, offering companionship, art, music, and yes, even storytelling. In some towns, the brothel was the only place you could hear a woman sing solo in public. Churches forbade it. Guilds forbade it. But here, her voice soars over a sea of clinking mugs. She finishes her song and bows with exaggerated flair. A round of applause and a few copper coins fly her way. She catches one mid-air and grins. Thank you. I'll be here until the abbess shuts us down again. Laughter rolls across the room. You sip your drink, something warm and spiced, possibly fermented, possibly dangerous, but it doesn't matter. You're caught in the current of a living, breathing, chaotic performance house. Take Avignon, for example. Historical records mention brothels hosting public dinners. That's right. Anyone could buy a seat and eat stew among the workers. Imagine bringing your date to a medieval Olive Garden, but with more garters and less garlic. In Florence, brothels offered dance nights. Clients paid an entry fee to twirl with the girls to fiddle music under candlelight. And in parts of Spain, some houses employed in-house jesters, yes, full-time comedic staff. Imagine bombing your set in a room where half the audience is naked. And get this, In some brothels there were reading corners, not libraries mind you, just a shelf or two. But still, literacy was rare, books were priceless. And here were girls quoting poetry and translating Latin jokes. Why? Because wit and charm sold just as well as curve. One story from Ghent tells of a brothel worker who could recite Cicero while balancing a tray of ale mugs. Did it actually happen? Historians still argue whether this was genuine talent or a drunken legend. But either way, the image is delightful. People come for the bodies, says the girl now sliding into the seat beside you, but they stay for the gossip. She's got deep dimples and sharper eyes. Want to hear who cried last night? You nod slowly. City guard, big guy, chainmail walked in like thunder, left holding hands with Marta and promising to write poetry. She sighs. He won't. This isn't a place where people hide their dreams. They parade them, even the silly ones. One girl wants to open a bakery. Another wants to paint portraits. One claims she's saving up to buy her brother's freedom from debt prison. Though she never quite says how much she's saved. Maybe she doesn't know. You hear footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate. Someone is pacing, practicing lines, building courage, dodging the rent collect. All of the above, back at your table. A card game has started. Not for money, for favors. The winner gets to pick next week's meal. Second place gets the mattress with the least hay poking through. Last place has to clean the boots of the city treasurer, who's mysteriously visiting tomorrow night. A woman in red walks past your table, arms full of folded cloth, not lingerie, costumes. She's on her way to change for the next set. And yes, she calls it. This one's my noble lady outfit, she mutters. Someone ordered a countess fantasy. Probably can't spell countess, but whatever. You can't help but laugh. She grins. Hey, laugh all you want. If I sell him the illusion, he tips like he's funding a monastery. You ask her if the performances ever go unscripted. Oh, all the time, she says. Once I pretended to faint during a sonnet. He panicked and confessed to cheating on his taxes. She disappears behind a curtain. The evening rolls on. A woman reads palms in the corner. Another plays a trick with coins, vanishing them into her sleeve. Then her mouth. Then someone's wine cup. A small crowd cheers. At the far end of the room, someone begins to dance again, this time barefoot. The music shifts, slower, more sultry, but still playful. You hear someone sigh, another whisper, I could live here forever. No one disagrees. And here's the thing, no one's being naive. These women know exactly where they are. They know the risks, the toll. But for now, they're not window props. They're performers. They're hosts. They're people weaving joy into a world that rarely offered them anything for free. You remember reading once that in 15th century London, a girl named Emmeline ran away from her father's bakery to join a brothel. Not for the money, but because she wanted to act in the morality plays the madam hosted twice a month. Her father tried to drag her back. The judge ruled in her favor. Let that sink in. A woman clinks her cup against yours and says, bet you thought this place would be sadder. You admit that, yeah, you did. She shrugs. We have sad days, but tonight's not one. You look around. Laughter, music, comfort, community. It's messy and fragile. Yes, but also alive. And as the curtain rises again and someone in a very fake-looking bishop's robe trips over a lute string and gets a full room of applause, you realize something. This isn't just a brothel. This is medieval nightlife. You've been here long enough to be trusted, at least by the madam, who now gestures for you to follow her. She waves away your questions with a flick of her fingers and heads up the narrow stairs again. Don't touch the railing, she mutters. Someone spilled honey on it, on purpose, I suspect. You climb. The hallway on the second floor is darker, quieter, and smells like beeswax, stale wine, and something you can't quite place. Cloves? Ash? A hint of nervous perfume? The madam stops at the first door on the left. We'll start with the love nest, she says with a smirk. She opens the door. The room is small, low-ceilinged, and crooked in that unmistakably medieval way, like it was built by a drunk architect with a grudge against symmetry. One wall leans suspiciously, and the bed is propped up on 2 books and what looks like half a butter churn. But the room is trying its best. There are velvet curtains, a faded rug, a little table with a jug of water, and a single flower in a chipped goblet. The candlelight flickers over the wooden walls, casting dancing shadows that feel more romantic than they have any right to. Customers love this one, the madam says. No idea why. The mattress squeaks like a goose in a sack, and the window barely opens. But they always ask for it. She runs her fingers along the bedpost. It's not about luxury. It's about illusion. People don't come here for truth. They get that at home. You leave the room and continue down the hallway. Door number 2 creaks open to reveal a completely different atmosphere. This room is colder, sparse, no decorations. A single wooden chair in the corner. Bed with no canopy. A rope hanging from a ceiling beam for hanging laundry, you assume, or hope. This one, she says quietly, is for men who want to be punished. Not like that, she adds quickly. I mean, maybe like that, but mostly it's just guilt. They come in, ask for silence, lie down fully clothed and cry into the mattress for an hour. We charge full price. You blink. Hey, she says. Don't judge. Sometimes a man just needs to weep near a woman who won't ask questions. Scarlet curtains, painted panels with birds and vines. A huge feather-stuffed pillow at the head of the bed, and a mirror cracked. Yes, but large, leaning against one wall. A vanity table holds pots of rouge, crushed coal, and combs with other people's hair still in them. This is the fancy room. One of the girls leans against the window, smoking something out of a long pipe. This is where we pretend to be royalty, she says. They want to be seduced like dukes, even if they smell like old cheese, and they love watching themselves, especially the ones with swords. It's always look how manly I look holding my dagger. Please. Here's a curious historical detail. In many medieval brothels, mirrors were considered exotic luxuries, and were placed not for vanity, but for security. They let the madam or other workers peek into rooms discreetly from the hallway, or through angled slats. Some were angled to show only feet. If the feet stopped moving too long, someone knocked on the door. The walls are tiled in what looks like crude stonework, and there's a shelf with glass bottles, rosewater, vinegar, maybe mint oil. The madam sighs. Bathhouse brothels were big in southern Europe. This is our poor attempt. No running water, obvious. We boil it in the kitchen and carry it up by bucket. But for an extra coin, you can soak while someone sings to you. Most people just fall asleep. You nod. The smell here is nicer. Lavender and heat. Less desperation, more but the illusion fades the moment you spot the chamber pot in the corner, half covered by a towel embroidered with a heart. She opens another door. This room is tiny, closet-sized. One narrow cot, no blanket, no deck. This is where the girls sleep when we're full, the madam says, and her tone softens. Not always, but sometimes. We try to rotate. You're quiet. There's a starkness to it, a reminder. These performers, these flirtatious philosophers and acrobatic singers, they're not floating through a dreamscape, they're working. And when they stop working, they sleep wherever there's space. Sometimes it's here, or worse. She leads you to the last room. This one has a window seat. Sunlight, what little's left of it, spills across the boards. Two girls sit cross-legged on a rug, playing with wooden dice. They don't look up. There's a book between them, open to a page with sketches, something that looks like a fable or saint's tale. One of them hums. This is the reading room, the madam says, a little proud. We only have 4 books, but they're ours. No one steals them. If they try, we cut off a toe. You raise an eyebrow. Kidding. Most. And here's the quirky bit. Some brothels were known for their tiny libraries, not because they wanted to educate their workers, though some did, but because clients were impressed. A girl who could quote Ovid, or even recite prayers in Latin, was worth more. Literacy was sexy, apparently. You step back into the hallway. Every room tells a different story, the madam says. But don't get it twisted. They're all about the same thing. What's that, you ask? She smirks. Control. We let them feel like they're in charge for a little while. But everything here is our stage, our rules, our rooms. She leaves you standing there for a moment, surrounded by crooked walls and secrets soaked into every floorboard. You glance down at the last room again, where the girls are still playing dice, laughing at something you can't hear, and you realize something. The medieval brothel was not just a place of flesh, it was a space of architecture, ritual, illusion, and strangely, each room a different spell, a different fantasy, tailored for different kinds of longing, and every creaky board underfoot, a reminder that behind the lace and laughter lies a scaffolding of survival. You're back in the main room again, sipping something dangerously warm as 2 women argue over a shade of lipstick made from crushed elderberries. One says it's too dark. The other insists it brings out her eyes. Nearby, a third girl adjusts her corset, more for effect than support. And across the room, someone's practicing a wink in a cracked mirror, alternating left and right eyes with the dedication of a monk copying scripture. Yes, this is medieval glamour at work. You were expecting rags, weren't you? Maybe sackcloth and grease. But brothel fashion was its own beast. Bold, bright, exaggerated, and designed to be seen and remembered. In a world where most respectable women were expected to wear muted tones and keep their hair under a veil, brothel workers did the opposite. Every piece of fabric was loud on purpose. Take the colors. Yellow was the classic marker of the profession in many European cities, literally mandated in places like Vienna and Florence. Not a golden sunset yellow, mind you, but a glaring, mustardy shade that couldn't be missed. Why? So they'd stand out, be visible, be labeled, a kind of walking warning sign that happened to draw crowds. But they didn't stop there. You'd see bright oranges, deep reds, rich purples when they could get them. These weren't just colors. They were statements, rebellion worn in folds and pleats. One woman walks past you now, in a green dress, so vivid it looks like it was stolen from spring itself. She's pinned a wooden brooch to the neckline shaped like a fig. You ask why. Because it looks like something dirty if you squint, she says with a grin. You raise your cup, and then there's makeup. Forget your fancy French luxury brands. These girls were chemists, artists, and risk-takers, with access to alarming ingredients. White lead mixed with vinegar for a pale complexion, check. Crushed berries and beet juice for lips and cheeks, absolutely. Burnt almonds for eyeliner, all the rage. But here's the kicker, they used rabbit fat as a base for most of it. Soft, spreadable, and vaguely horrifying. Imagine smearing that on your eyelids in July. Oh, and don't forget crocodile dung, one woman chimes in from across the room, rubbing something into her arms. It's for the smell. You blink. The smell of what? She grins. Mystery. In Egypt and the Mediterranean, it was common to find references to exotic ingredients like crocodile dung, civet oil, and even powdered pearls in beauty recipes. Whether these were actually used in European brothels is debated, but if a traveller brought it in, you bet they'd try it, and probably charge extra for the aroma. Historians still argue whether these women were genuinely trying to beautify or whether the heavy makeup was part of the costume, a way to distance themselves from their off-duty selves. Some believe the layers of rouge, kohl, and oils were less about attraction, and more about creating a character. Not a woman, but a fantasy of a woman. You watch now as two girls help each other braid their hair. One has tied tiny bells into her plaits. The other uses bright blue ribbon. They're joking, gently teasing. You look like a goose trying to impress a bishop, and in the mirror their smiles are real. Let's talk accessories. Shoes? Impractical. Thin leather with pointed toes, sometimes extended to absurd length. In places like Krakow, you'd see women tottering through alleys in shoes so long they curled up at the end like elf boots. For flirtation maybe, for actual walking, a nightmare. Jewelry, a mix of stolen, gifted and cleverly forged. A bronze ring painted to look gold. A brooch, shaped like a lily, the symbol of both purity and ironically lust. Some wore bells on their ankles, others tied ribbons around their wrists, often with knots, symbolizing contracts, secrets or personal pledges. Medieval brothels didn't smell like lavender and linen, they smelled like humanity, so girls made perfume from herbs steeped in vinegar, rose petals or brace yourself ambergris. Yes, the waxy stuff found in sperm whale intestines. If it smelled musky and exotic, it was fair game. Oh, and don't forget garlic, someone says. Garlic, as a repellent. You blink again. For bad customers, she clarifies. If he's mean and I don't want him to come back, I dab garlic behind my ears. Works every time. You make a mental note to never cross her. The madam passes by and eyes the room. Girls, if I see one more of you in a ripped hem, I'm docking coin. Fix it or pin it. We're not barbarians, someone mutters. I liked being a barbarian. The madam doesn't hear or pretends not to. Here's the quirky bit. In some cities, brothel workers were banned from wearing the same styles as honest women. In Nuremberg, for example, a sumptuary law required them to wear a striped hood at all times in public. But guess what happened? They made it fashionable. Soon other women started wearing the same hood by accident. The council had to issue a second decree banning non-workers from copying the style, medieval trend-setting at its finest. As you finish your drink, one woman walks by with painted nails. Yes, nails dyed red with madder root. You ask how long it lasts. Until I scrub a floor or slap a knight, she replies, whichever comes first. The thing is, all this effort, the clothing, the rouge, the elaborate hairstyles, it wasn't about male gaze alone. It was armor, persona, pageantry, and yes, maybe sometimes joy, because when your world judges you for how you survive, you might as well survive in color. And now as a new customer walks in and the whole room subtly shifts, spines straightening, lips parted, glances sharpened, you see the final flourish of their craft. It's the wink, small, effortless, devastating, a moment of performance so quick it's barely real, but it hit every time. One of the girls catches you watching and winks at you. But this time, there's no performance behind it, just a tired camaraderie, like saying, "You see it now, don't you?" You nod. She walks on, her bells softly jingling, skirt swishing like applause. You open a creaky door and find yourself in a quiet, candlelit chamber. No laughter here, no perfume in the air, just the faint scent of wax and old parchment. This isn't the brothel, it's the confessional booth, and outside its wooden screen, a priest is shifting uncomfortably, not because of sin, but because of taxes. Yes, welcome to one of the most bizarre and hypocritical relationships in medieval society, the church and the brothel. Two institutions that should have been diametrically opposed, but somehow weren't. You sit back as a bell tolls somewhere, and a nun passes by muttering prayers in Latin. You'd think the clergy would have been up in arms about the whole thing, storming the red light districts with torches and righteous fury, but reality, as always, was murkier than the paintings made it seem. Start with the official stance. The church publicly condemned prostitution as sinful: lust, fornication, corruption of the soul. You know the drill. Church fathers quoted Augustine and Aquinas with gusto, describing harlots as necessary evils in a broken world. Necessary, you ask? Yes, necessary. St. Thomas Aquinas once likened prostitutes to sewer drains, repulsive, but crucial to the hygiene of the city. Remove them, he warned, and society will be overrun with lust. So rather than try to eliminate brothels entirely, the church often preferred to manage them out of sight, out of chaos, and they really did manage them. In some cities, Avignon being a famous example, the church directly profited from brothels. The papacy collected rent from brothel buildings, taxed the sex trade, and even regulated its operation. Yes, that's right, the holiest men in Christendom sometimes acted like very sanctified landlords. You lean against a wall stunned while a friar walks by humming. He smells faintly of ale. Historians still argue whether this kind of involvement was cynical pragmatism or some warped form of mercy. Was the church trying to protect women from worse abuses by supervising them, or were they just looking the other way for coin? The evidence swings both ways. In fact, in 14th century London, bishops' brothels were a thing. That's not a nickname, that's literal. The Bishop of Winchester controlled a section of Southwark that was infamous for its bawdy houses. The women who worked there were even called Winchester geese, a cheerful-sounding term, until you learn they were often buried in unconsecrated ground, just outside the city walls, because heaven apparently had a dress code. Still, in the confessional, things were strict. A woman caught working in the trade might be forced to do penance, walking barefoot around the church, or fasting for weeks, or if the priest was feeling spicy, carrying a candle as tall as she was while reciting psalms in front of a gawking congregation. One penitent was reportedly ordered to wear a sign around her neck, reading, "I fed lust, and now I feed on shame." Harsh? Certainly. Effective? Debatable. You can almost hear the girls back at the brothel rolling their eyes. That's your worst punishment. Try talking to Geoffrey the Spitter. Still, fear of damnation was real. Many women worked by day and confessed by night, creating a cycle of guilt and absolution that the church, perhaps intentionally, never broke. You start to realize for all their sermons, priests weren't really trying to fix anything. They were just managing the tension. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some monks were so concerned about falling into temptation that they wrote detailed instructions on how to resist lust. often in the most graphic terms imaginable. Entire treatises about how to not be around. One even advised, if a woman approaches, picture her as a bag of bones and excrement. Charming. Of course, not every priest resisted. In fact, some brothels had regular visits from men of the cloth, sometimes in disguise, sometimes not. There are records of clergy being caught mid-act, swiftly excommunicated, and then wait for it reinstated a few weeks later with a healthy donation. They all find God eventually, she says, but only after they find me first. There was also a loophole you're not going to believe. The idea of temporary marriages. In cities where brothels were banned outright, some enterprising clergy offered short-term marital contracts, essentially licenses to sin for a weekend or so. Want to spend time with a woman without being damned? Just marry her on Friday and annul it by Monday. It was the medieval version of Vegas. This wasn't church doctrine, of course, but it happened enough times that some councils had to explicitly outlaw it. Meanwhile, in paintings and stained glass, prostitutes were often cast as the ultimate cautionary tale. You'd see Mary Magdalene, miscast for centuries as a harlot, kneeling at Christ's feet in tearful repentance, or Eve, blamed eternally for that pesky apple. Sin, they taught, begins with a woman's glance. But behind the art and the lectures there was something stranger, a grudging respect. These women knew things. They had influence. In some towns, brothel workers were feared as witches or oracles. Men whispered that they could hex you with a touch or speak your future with a kiss. You're not sure if that's power or paranoia, but either way, it wasn't nothing. A group of pilgrims walks past you now, chanting. One breaks from the pack to toss a coin toward a nearby woman. She doesn't even look up, just catches it mid-air and goes on fixing her hair. You sigh. The hypocrisy is so thick you could spread it on bread. And yet, the girls survive. They find loopholes. They flirt with damnation like it's a game of dice. One of them even wears a tiny rosary around her ankle. Not blasphemy, just balance. The church may have preached fire and brimstone, but on the streets, mercy wore rouge and a smirk. The priest finally sits in his booth and clears his throat. Next, he says, not even looking up, you step forward, because honest, after tonight, you might need to confess just for watching. You step into a dimly lit council chamber, stone walls, iron sconces, and the faint scuff of boots on flagstones. There's a musty mix of candle smoke and damp paper hanging in the air. A circle of serious-looking men in cloaks huddle around a wooden table, talking not about trade, taxes, or even war, but about sex. Well, more specifically, how to manage it. Welcome to the often bizarre world of medieval municipal governance, where town officials, some barely literate, took it upon themselves to regulate one of the most unruly aspects of urban life, prostitution. And right away, your modern brain is probably thinking, wait, this wasn't just illegal, but that's where the medieval mindset surprises you again. Many cities didn't outlaw brothels. They licensed, and those licenses came with rules so detailed, they could have filled a little red rulebook of their own. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, major European cities like Paris, London, Florence, and Nuremberg had formal brothel districts, ghettos of sin that were publicly mapped, guarded, taxed, and patrolled. In some places they were even walled off at night like naughty snow globes. Amsterdam's red light district wasn't a modern invention, it was just a slicker reboot. The idea behind regulation was simple. If you can't stop the sin, you might as well shape it. So town councils stepped in. They dictated where brothels could exist, usually near rivers or far from churches, when they could operate, no business on holy days, and what the women could wear, believe it or not, specific colors and hem lengths. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Toulouse, sex workers were required to wear striped clothing, almost like medieval uniform. But in some towns the rules were more ironic than punitive, like in Vienna, where prostitutes were banned from dressing too modestly, so they wouldn't be mistaken for respectable women. You had to flaunt it, legally. You smile at the absurdity. Imagine getting fined for wearing too much skirt. City fathers didn't just micromanage clothing though. They regulated everything from bathhouse licenses to customer behavior. In Avignon, for instance, there were fines for anyone who visited a brothel after dark unless they carried a lantern. Why? To cut down on theft and mistaken identity, or perhaps to prevent drunken stumbles into the wrong alcove. You lean closer to the council table as they roll out a scroll, the official rules of the house. It's got everything from health checks, rudimentary at best, to tax percentages usually about 10%. And yes, the city got a cut. These were not just moral judgments, they were revenue streams. Historians still argue whether municipal oversight genuinely helped protect women, or simply institutionalized their exploitation. Some say the regular checks and fixed wages created a safer environment. Others believe it just locked women into servitude with a smile and an invoice. And here's the kicker. Not all women in the trade had the same rules. The line between independent courtesans, state-licensed workers, and outright illegal freelancers was blurry. Cities often cracked down hard on unregistered sex workers, not out of concern, but because they weren't paying their share. It wasn't morality, it was math. Take Venice, for example. In the 14th century, officials actually relocated brothels near popular markets in an effort to distract men from pursuing each other. Yes, really. One ordinance specifically states that increasing commerce of women might help curb unnatural violence. Talk about urban planning with a side of panic. As you listen, one older councilman taps the table and brings up a concern. What of the soldiers? And suddenly, everyone leans in. Towns near barracks often experienced spikes in brothel activity, and predictably, spikes in crime and disease. So cities like Bruges established temporary brothels just outside the town walls, called Tents of Venus, to serve passing troops and keep them from harassing locals. You can't help but imagine the awkward job posting. Wanted, polite, patriotic woman for short-term contractual work, must tolerate chainmail. Another councilman suggests closing the brothels on Fridays. Someone else snorts. The room divides. A vote is taken. It failed. See, this wasn't easy. Laws were written, rewritten, ignored, enforced, and ignored again. The regulations changed as quickly as the mood of the mayor, or the pressure from the church, or complaints from jealous wives, or outbreaks of plague. Oh, and that's a detail worth lingering on. Plague changed everything. During outbreaks, brothels were often shuttered instantly. Women were blamed for spreading corruption, and some were even accused of being plague vectors. The irony, of course, is that their clients, rich merchants and clergymen, kept slipping through side doors even as the bodies piled up. You step back from the council table and slip into a side street. Out here the laws look very different. In some towns the unwritten rules mattered more than the official ones. Local guards turned blind eyes for the right price. Tavern owners housed private rooms that weren't listed on any registry. In London's Southwark district, brothels operated under fake names like silk shops or spice houses, which technically wasn't a lie if you squinted hard enough. And then there were the women who thrived outside the law altogether. They worked by code, by reputation, or by connection. A particularly clever madam might have a bishop's ear or a merchant's protection. No council could touch her. No law could reach her. You pass by a wooden door marked with a simple red slash. No sign, no lantern. But the guards glance away when someone knocks twice and enters. A town crier walks by, announcing tomorrow's feast day. Behind him, two women in striped gowns vanish into an alley. You wonder which one is licensed and which one is outlawed. But then again, maybe they don't even care. Maybe they've found their own rule, and maybe that's the real game here. Playing within the system just long enough to learn how to cheat it. You step inside a dim chapel late at night. Candles flicker. Incense curls up towards stone arches, and a monk hums a sleepy chant. The pews are empty, except for one nervous man kneeling near the altar. His robes mark him as clergy, but the woman standing beside him, with her fine veil and mischievous smile, most certainly is not. That soft crunch you hear, that's the boundary between sin and sanctity being ground underfoot. The relationship between the church and prostitution in the Middle Ages was, to put it mildly, complicated. Not just morally, politically, financially, personally. On paper, prostitution was a mortal sin, damning, shameful, and to be avoided at all costs. But in practice, the church often tolerated, taxed, and even used the system, like a parent who says don't touch the cookies, and then sneaks a few when nobody's looking. Your mainstream historical fact: many church-owned properties housed brothels. In fact, in several cities, the bishop's estate rented space to madams, knowing full well what kind of business would take place. The justification: better the sin be contained than spread chaotically. Yes, that was their logic. Like organizing your vices into neat folders. This strange double standard created a world where bishops condemned harlots from the pulpit on Sunday, then quietly paid them visits on Monday. It wasn't just rumors, it was Some monasteries had female servants, whose roles, if you squint at the ledgers, involved a lot of food preparation, laundry, and overnight stays. There are surviving letters where bishops scold priests for fraternizing with prostitutes, only to be caught doing the same later. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was normalized. And now, your fringe tidbit. One 13th century papal advisor proposed building a clergy-only brothel in Rome to reduce scandals involving public streetwalkers. It never officially happened, or at least no one left behind a receipt, but the idea made it as far as discussion, which is wild enough. You pause beside a column, listening to the sermon still echoing from earlier that day. Words like virtue, purity, and temptation had floated through the air like perfume. And yet, behind the altar, tucked beneath the priest's chamber, there's a door that leads somewhere less holy. Historians still argue whether church tolerance of prostitution was about compassion, control, or pure hypocrisy. Some defend it as a lesser evil strategy, a way to manage desire without collapsing the social order. Others see it as proof that power always finds a loophole, even in the sacred. It wasn't all cynicism though. There were also real, heartfelt attempts at reform, many driven by women. You walk through the garden of a convent, where a small group of nuns tends to herbs and soft-spoken prayers. Here in this quiet place, former sex workers were taken in, sheltered, and given a chance to start over. Some cities even built Magdalene houses, named for Mary Magdalene, whom medieval Christians believed was a former prostitute turned saint. These refuges were meant to offer penance and peace, sowing scripture study and silence, lots of silence. But not everyone came willingly. Some women were forced into convents after arrest, or after their families discovered their shameful past. For them, the garden walls might have felt more like a prison than sanctuary. You see, the church loved redemption stories. They made great sermons, but it loved control more. Back in town, sermons against prostitution were regular events. Priests would stand in the marketplace, wagging fingers and quoting scripture, painting prostitutes as demons in disguise. One monk even wrote that every brothel was a devil's chapel, where men's souls went to rot. Bit dramatic? Maybe, but it sold well. At the same time, these same churches blessed the brothel keepers' marriages, buried them in holy ground, and took their confessions without flinch. There's a famous case in Cologne where a high-ranking priest publicly denounced a brothel, then bequeathed a generous donation to one in his will. Perhaps he just had strong opinions about customer service. Medieval scholars loved to debate whether prostitution was an unavoidable evil or a necessary function of society. St. Augustine famously said that without prostitutes, capricious lusts would lead to worse crimes. Better to have a pressure valve, he argued, like a moral sewage system. Romantic, right? Thomas Aquinas, meanwhile, called prostitutes the sewer of the palace. Unpleasant, but essential. As long as the palace stayed clean, the church looked the other way. And then there were the visions. Mystics occasionally had dreams where they saw prostitutes burning in hell, or ascending to heaven, weeping with joy after repenting. One nun claimed she saw a soul lifted from purgatory because she had once fed a hungry child with her earnings. Stories like that spread fast. Hope, after all, sells better than fire and brimstone. As you follow a group of pilgrims into a roadside chapel, you notice something odd. Several of them are whispering prayers not to saints, but to Mary Magdalene. Not the virginal Virgin Mary, but the fallen woman. She had become a symbol of hope for those with troubled pasts, those who knew the weight of shame. And yes, sex workers often prayed to her too, quietly, desperately. Some even wore small tokens, rings or bracelets, with discreet carvings of her weeping figure. These weren't just accessories, they were protection, maybe even rebellion, because despite the sermons, the sneers and the rules, many sex workers still believed they were souls worthy of grace. And suddenly you realize, the church didn't just hate prostitution, it needed it, to preach against, to forgive, to regulate, to exploit, and sometimes quietly, shamefully, to indulge. It was a mirror of everything the church wanted to control in society: sin, sex, power, and confession. You're standing in a bustling medieval town square. The air smells like roasted chestnuts, fresh manure, and just a trace of yesterday's regret. Merchants shout, chickens squawk, and over by the red-painted house at the corner, yes, that one, a long line of men waits quietly, coins clinking in nervous pockets. Business is booming. Prostitution in medieval Europe wasn't just tolerated, it was a reliable economic engine. For some towns it was as much a financial necessity as the grain market or the salt trade. And brothels? They weren't just dens of vice, they were enterprises. Let's talk money. A working girl in 14th century Paris could make more in one day than a laundress made in a week. That's your mainstream historical fact. The margins were tight. Pimps and brothel owners often took the lion's share, but for a woman with no inheritance, no husband and no trade, it could be the fastest way to avoid starvation. You shuffle past the bakery and the cobbler's stall, heading toward the official brothel. Yes, official. Many towns had state-sanctioned houses of prostitution known locally as stews, hof, or bordels. These places weren't illegal, they were regulated, taxed, and in some cities even advertised. One English brothel kept a painted sign out front that read simply, "Clean girls, good prices, no." These establishments paid rent to the city, fees for licenses, fines for breaking curfews, and sometimes even donated to religious festivals, which meant the town got a reliable cash flow while maintaining the illusion of moral high ground. It's like taxing cigarettes while running anti-smoking campaigns. The stewards who managed brothels were sometimes appointed by the town council, and they kept meticulous books, lists of who worked there when, how much they earned, and what fees were deducted. These surviving ledgers give us an unusually detailed window into medieval sex work. It's basically HR for harlots. Now your quirky tidbit. In 15th century Augsburg, Germany, sex workers were required to pay a bed tax, but only if the bed in question had been used that day. This led to some highly creative definitions of sleeping arrangements, including blankets on floors and hammocks. When you start dodging taxes like a startup in the Caymans, you know it's serious business. As you wander through the City Hall archives, don't worry, there's candlelight. You stumble upon something even stranger. Brothels often supported public works. In many towns, revenue from prostitution was earmarked for bridge repairs, road paving, and even church bell maintenance. That's right, you could theoretically ring a bell on Sunday that had been funded entirely by Saturday night sins. Some places were bolder than others. In Toulouse, authorities created a literal municipal brothel run by the city, guarded by city watchmen, and open only during approved hours. The profits were pumped directly into public coffers. Bureaucracy has never been so spicy. And then there were the price control. Local governments didn't just tax brothels, they regulated them like utility companies. Rules dictated not only how much a client paid, but how many clients a woman could legally serve per day, what services were allowed, and sometimes even how long a session could last. No, we will not be timing you with an hourglass. One surviving ordinance from Bruges forbade brothel workers from charging more than 4 stewards per customer, and warned that overcharging in matters of the flesh shall not be tolerated. There is something hilarious about city clerks earnestly writing this stuff with quill pens. Now, historians still argue whether this regulation was done out of concern for the women or for the men. Some say it was meant to prevent exploitation. Others believe it was about preserving male control and limiting women's ability to gain wealth or independence through sex work. Either way, the rules were enforced with surprising vigor. And what about inflation? In boom towns with a flood of soldiers or merchants, think port cities, pilgrimage routes, or mining centers, demand could drive prices sky high. This led to pop-up brothels, freelance streetwalkers, and the dreaded price wars. It's not just a medieval problem. Economics, like lust, follows its own rules. At one point in Avignon, the Pope's city no less, the brothel industry was so lucrative that wealthy merchants bought into it like it was real estate. They didn't run the houses too scandalous, but they owned the land and building. Passive income, medieval style, and yes, the church got its cut too, through indirect taxes, rent on properties, or convenient silence. You step now into a quieter alleyway, where a discreet door opens to a finer establishment. Here, courtesans, not streetwalkers, take center stage. They cost more, offer wine, poetry, witty conversation, and the illusion of romance. Their clients, often nobles, clerics, and visiting diplomats. Courtesans paid higher fees to operate independently. Some employed their own servants and guards. Others maintained apartments with velvet curtains, imported oils, and entire wardrobes tailored to each man's fantasy. You run a hand along the velvet wall. This wasn't survival, it was strategy. For women clever enough to navigate the system, prostitution could mean upward mobility, financial power, even soft political influence. A few retired wealthy, a few even married into nobility, but the line between control and exploitation was razor thin. Women in brothels often owed debts to owners, guards, suppliers, and were kept working under threat of arrest, eviction, or worse. Some were tricked into the trade through fake job offers or family pressure. Once inside, escape was difficult. Still, some resist. You pass a small graffiti tag, scratched into the wall of a city brothel, a stylized flower with the words "not yours," a tiny rebellion, a reminder that even within the gears of profit and punishment, some women held on to a sense of. In the end, medieval prostitution was never just about sex. It was about money, and money, as always, greased the wheels of power. It paved roads, built bridges, filled church bowls, and lined the pockets of the same men who condemned it. And as you head back into the square where the last candles flicker in windows and a sleepy guard yawns by the gate, you realize something simple and infuriating. Vice was always on the book. You're still moving quietly through medieval streets, but this time, the buildings seem more imposing. Stone towers loom, cloister bells toll gently in the background, and just ahead, beneath a carved archway, a group of black-robed men murmurs Latin prayers while glancing side-eye toward the neighborhood brothel. The church has arrived, and it's very, very conflicted. See, the medieval church didn't exactly approve of prostitution, but it also didn't ban it outright. In the same way a modern parent might sigh and say, "Well, I'd prefer if you didn't." The church occupied a paradoxical position, morally condemning sex work, while practically tolerating and occasionally profiting from it. You ease into a wooden pew in the back of a drafty chapel, just out of sight, and listen as a local priest gives a sermon. He speaks of sin, of lust, of Eve's temptation, but you notice that no one seems in a hurry to actually enforce a crackdown. Why? Because the church believed that prostitution prevented worse sins. That's your mainstream historical fact. St. Augustine himself wrote that without prostitution, society would crumble under the weight of uncontrolled male lust. Better a brothel than the rape of respectable women. It's the theological equivalent of a pressure release valve. In other words, let them sin in this specific, contained way, so they don't sin in worse, chaotic ones. But that doesn't mean it was a free pass. Church leaders regularly preached against sex work, especially from the pulpit. Prostitutes were denied burial in consecrated ground. Many had to wear distinctive clothing like yellow hoods or striped veils to mark them publicly. It was shame as policy, and you lean closer now into the shadows of the cloister, where a group of monks debates something over ink-stained scrolls. One argues that the women should be forgiven if they repent. Another insists they're unredeemable. Yet another wonders, probably too loudly, if they tie. Historians still argue whether this public shaming actually reduced prostitution, or just made the women's lives harder. There's little evidence of a decline, and plenty of stories about hypocrisy. Priests and monks were frequent customers. Confessionals weren't always used for absolution. Take the tale of Bishop Engelbert of Cologne, known for his sermons on purity. He was also rumored to have maintained a personal spiritual advisor who worked nights in the red light district. No one wrote that down officially, of course, but let's say the nuns whisper. You stroll past a Dominican convent. The walls are thick, the gates locked, but inside some women took in former sex workers, those who repented and sought a new life. There were conversion houses across Europe, part charity, part prison, where ex-prostitutes lived under strict supervision, shaved their heads, and wore sackcloth robes. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some cities these converted women were called Magdalens, a nod to Mary Magdalene, rebranded as the archetype of the repentant harlot. Over time, their communal houses became both places of refuge and of intense moral control. It wasn't a happy ending so much as a long, silent time out. Still, not all clerics were scolds. Some reformist priests tried to improve the lives of working women, offering medical care or safe sleeping spaces, usually with strings attached. Others held secret masses just for them, at odd hours of night, beneath flickering candles, a little guilt with your grace. One prominent French abbé even kept detailed diaries of his interactions with prostitutes, framing them as case studies for saving souls. Sure, that's definitely what that was. And then we come to the strange case of brothel chapels. Yes, chapels. Inside some larger licensed brothels, particularly in cities like London and Avignon, there were small oratories where the women could pray, before or after work, sometimes during. A nun might have fainted, but the priests just nodded. He'd seen worse, because ultimately the church had a line it wouldn't cross. closing the brothels entirely. Too many civic leaders relied on them, too much money changed hands, and the idea of men wandering unsatisfied into the streets terrified the clergy more than the sin itself. So instead, they pivoted. Prostitution became a teaching tool. See what happens when women disobey. This is the cost of temptation. In stained glass, the fallen woman was a common figure, sometimes weeping, sometimes consumed by fire, always cautionary. But you know better. You've seen her backroom smile. You've watched her count coin with a smirk. You've heard her whisper secrets through a shutter to a man in velvet shoes. She may be painted as the caution, but she knows how this world works. Still, the church wasn't above direct action. Brothels were shuttered, women thrown into jails or laundries, owners fined, crowds would cheer. For a week, maybe two, the district would go quiet. And then, quietly, things reopened. Somewhere down the alley, a new red door would appear, a different sign, the same faces behind the curtain, because lust, like faith, finds a way. You glance up now at the tall arched window above the altar. A dove glows golden in the stained glass. Beneath it a thin line of graffiti carved by someone, centuries ago, better a sinner than a starving saint. You can almost hear the candle flicker in agreement. The air in this part of town smells different. Less hay and sweat, more clove, saffron, and whatever passes for luxury in a district where lace is real. But the windows don't open properly. You ease past two drunk merchants slumped against a stone pillar and duck into a low doorway trimmed with velvet. But no, she's sitting quietly in the back corner, reading accounts by candlelight, a ledger balanced on one knee, and a knowing smirk curling at the edge of her mouth. This isn't a courtesan, this is a businesswoman. In fact, madams ran the show more often than not. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The majority of medieval brothels were managed by women. They weren't just working girls who got promoted. They were powerful gatekeepers of the entire local sex economy, and you didn't cross them. The title varied by region. Abbess, bawd, mayor, bordeliera. Some of them dressed conservatively, others flamboyantly, but they all had one thing in common. You watch her now as she sends a younger girl to fetch water, beckons a knight upstairs without even glancing up, and waves off a tax collector with the flick of two fingers and a bottle of imported wine. She might not own the building, it might be leased from the city or a shady nobleman, but she runs it, top to bottom. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some places like 15th century Nuremberg, madams had to swear an official oath to the city council. It included clauses like not to beat the girls and not to harbour criminals, which naturally were regularly ignored, but the paperwork existed. Bureaucracy touches everything. You sit back in a threadbare armchair near the hearth and watch the politics unfold. A local merchant brings a gift, candied ginger from Venice, and asks for a favour. A city guard delivers a small coin pouch and receives a nod. Later, his friend will be allowed in the back without paying. And over in the corner, a scribe is scribbling names in a log that won't be seen by daylight. This brothel is more than a pleasure house, it's a microstate. Some madams were deeply embedded in city power structure. They paid taxes, secured licenses, bribed watchmen, and even sponsored feast day parades. Others used their influence for survival, lending money to poor families, sheltering girls from abusive homes or turning away dangerous clients. Historians still argue whether these women were exploiters or protectors. It's easy to paint them as profiteers, growing fat off the pain of others. But records show many madams were once sex workers themselves, and their establishments were often safer, cleaner, and more regulated than independent street work. That doesn't mean they were saints. You hear a muffled argument from upstairs, a door slams. The madam sighs but doesn't move. She knows the rhythm of her house. A few minutes later, the same woman returns with a bag of coins and a calm expression. Crisis over. No questions asked. Power in this world is quiet and constant. You lean over and notice her book. No religious texts here. Instead, a list of debts, monthly earnings, and something that looks suspiciously like a client blacklist. Too rough, doesn't pay. Smells like eel, efficient. And unlike the average nobleman, she manages her workforce with startling fairness, at least on paper. Women here might split their earnings, get hot meals, and even sleep without fear of theft. That wasn't universal, but it was better than most options available. Some even ran their own savings clubs. You can picture it now. A quiet Sunday afternoon, the girls gathered around a chip table, pooling coins into a tin box with plans for retirement, or a dress shop, or a husband who didn't ask too many questions. Occasionally the madam helps with that too. She knows everyone. She knows everything. Take the famous case of Madame Francesca in Prague, who once brokered peace between two rival mercenary captains using her girls as go-betweens. The official record lists it as informal diplomacy. We call it backroom brilliance. There's a sense of awe in the room now. Even the men, especially the men, walk carefully around her. A sharp word from her, and you're out. A gentle laugh and you're golden. And here comes the fringe detail. In some places, madams wielded legal power. In parts of Italy and Spain, they were allowed to bring cases to local courts as guardians of the women in their houses. That meant they could sue for damages, theft or breach of contract. Essentially, corporate law, bordello edition. You feel the weight of her presence, even as you leave the building. The girls kiss her cheek. The cook checks in before buying more bread. A courier bows low as he drops off a letter sealed in green wax. She tucks it into a sleeve. You might never know her real name. She's been called many things: sinner, manager, witch, mother. But here, in this district of hushed laughter and candlelight schemes, she wears the title that matters most. You're back outside now, the night air cooler, tinged with smoke from nearby braziers, and the faint scent of roasting chestnuts. Around the corner, a man stumbles into an alleyway, adjusting his belt with one hand and wiping lipstick from his cheek with the other. Behind him, faint sound of lute music drifts from an upstairs window. You follow the rhythm, not with your feet, but with your mind, wondering who really came to these places. The answer, as you're about to discover, is everyone. And yes, that includes knights and priests, especially priests. Let's start with the cliché, the swaggering knight in plate armor. You know the type: bold, battle-worn, probably on a crusade stopover. Except, it's a little less glamorous up close. He smells like old leather and wine, and he can't stop talking about the one time he almost jousted a bishop. Almost being the key word. Knights frequented brothels for more than pleasure. These places offered warmth, gossip, and a sense of normalcy far from the battlefield. Plus, they often paid in advance. Some brothels even gave military discounts or kept a tab for noble houses. That's your mainstream historical fact right there. Municipal brothels in cities like Avignon and Paris sometimes had arrangements with the military. Think of it as a highly informal veterans program, complete with bath privileges and reduced prices on feast days. You push open a creaky side door and step into a smoky tap room attached to the brothel proper. The energy this is where the men loiter before heading upstairs, or instead of heading upstairs depending on their budget or nerves. It's a social hub, equal parts waiting room and confession booth. And speaking of confessions, guess who's at the far table? A friar, robes slightly askew, cheeks flushed with wine, and laughing at something a girl just whispered in his ear. Don't be too shocked. Despite church teachings, clergy were frequent visitors. Some paid, others were comped. Still others offered spiritual guidance in exchange for private company. Your quirky tidbit: in certain towns, local brothels were run by the church. Yes, you heard that correctly. The bishopric of Constance, for instance, owned and profited from a brothel in the 15th century, under the logic that it reduced worse sins like adultery or sodomy. A righteous loophole, if ever there was one. But let's zoom out. Most clients weren't knights or clergy. They were regular guys, tailors, bakers, millers, blacksmiths. Men who'd worked all day, collected their coin, and now wanted a few hours of warmth, attention, and maybe a clean bed. You hear one now bartering over the cost of a second hour, apologizing for not having silver, and offering fresh bread in return. The madam doesn't blink. She's heard worse. Some places allowed barter, others ran strict coin-only policy. It depended on the town, the season, and how much the madam liked you. And here's something historians still argue about: were most clients single or married? The records don't always say, but court logs show a suspicious number of married men caught sneaking into brothels after Vesper. Surprise, surprise, you find a seat at the bar, sipping something warm and spiced, and let the stories come to you. There's the tanner, complaining about foot rot and asking if the red-haired girl is in tonight. There's the young student from the university, awkward and giddy, clutching a borrowed florin and reciting bad poetry. There's even an old nobleman, wheezing and half asleep, cradled by a patient courtesan, who keeps nodding as he recounts the same tale of youthful conquest for the 5th time this week. They come for comfort, for fantasy, for escape. Sometimes they come for love, or the closest thing to it that coin can buy. And now a fringe detail. Brothels sometimes maintained lists of preferred clients. These men, often city officials or prominent guild members, received priority access, personalized service, and occasional immunity from sudden price hikes. In Venice, the Libro dei Piaceri even documented client visits like a loyalty program. 10 visits, the 11th is discounted. Okay, maybe not exactly that, but you get the idea. And some of these men grew attached, obsessively so. You overhear one now, breathlessly promising to rescue a girl from her terrible fate and make her his mistress. She nods politely while stealing glances at the clock behind him. Romance has its place, but so does the next paying guest. You head toward the rear door again, brushing past a gaggle of apprentices from the fish market. Their pockets jingle nervously, their eyes dart with a mix of excitement and fear. One whispers, "Is it supposed to feel like this?" and his friend elbows him into silence. There's a universality here, different faces, different accents, but the same hunger for touch, for company, for being seen. Of course, not every man who walked through those doors was welcome. Violent drunkards, debt dodgers, overly pious scolds, they got bounced far, or worse, banned permanently. Yes, brothels had bouncers, usually large ex-soldiers or angry uncles. You slip out into the alley once more, the taproom door swinging closed behind you. A small crowd has gathered by the wall, where a lute player sings cheeky songs about bishops in love, and knights who can't keep their codpieces closed. You laugh with them, feeling the warmth of shared scandal. Not every client left happy, but every man who entered was forced to reckon with something bigger than pleasure. The fact that these houses, these women, these unspoken rules, held more power over the city than any church bell or knight's sword. You slip past the chatter in the street and head upstairs quietly now. The music fades behind thick wooden walls, and with each creaking stair, you leave the noise of the tavern world behind. This is where things get personal, where money becomes memory, where fantasy steps out of the shadows. The rooms above a medieval brothel are small, cramped, and candlelit. No windows, no clocks, just featherbeds, silk curtains if you're lucky, and sometimes a small basin of water that may or may not have been changed this week. Here the real work begins. And no, it's not as freeform as you might imagine. There are rules, in fact, depending on where and when you are. There might be a full list nailed discreetly to the inside of the door, written in Latin of course, because nothing says romance like ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The first rule: time limits. You don't just lounge around like a medieval Hugh Hefner. Most visits are strictly timed, half an hour to an hour, unless you're a very good client or just slipped the madam something extra. The second: no violence. It might seem obvious, but brothels took it seriously. Girls carried small knives or wore bells to signal trouble. Some had safe words, yes, even then, and some cities passed laws saying if a man harmed a sex worker, he could be publicly flogged or fined triple what he paid. Your mainstream fact. In 14th century Nuremberg, official brothel laws clearly outlined no hair pulling, no biting, and no curses invoking the devil, which honestly raises more questions than it answers. You open one door, just for a moment. Inside, a girl is laughing, not the forced coin for smiles laugh, but genuine. Her guest has brought her something rare, a small pouch of saffron. It's more precious than gold here, a treat she can sneak into tomorrow's stew or trade for linen. You close the door quiet. Across the hall, another room hums with music. Some clients paid for performers to play while they lay in bed, basking in imagined luxury. The girls roll their eyes but enjoy the tunes. Some of them even sing along. You pass a curtained alcove where someone has scrawled an old proverb on the wall in charcoal. Better a warm bed than a cold heart. Not bad, honestly. Could have been a Pinterest quote, minus the plague. There's a kind of performance to all this. The woman chooses her demeanor. Playful, maternal, shy, dominant, based on your cues. She listens closely. She reads your silences. She adjusts her voice, her posture, her gestures. You don't realize it, but she's directing the scene. Now here's a fringe tidbit. In Venice, women in the higher class brothels trained in specific personas. Some would pretend to be nuns, others noble women, even witches. Clients had their preferences, and the more elaborate the role play, the more florins it cost. One Venetian brothel even kept costumes on hand. And here comes an open scholarly debate. Were these rules truly enforced, or were they just for show? Some historians argue that written codes were more about appeasing the town council than protecting the women. Others believe enforcement varied wildly by region and leadership. Either way, the illusion of order made brothels seem less threatening and more civic-minded. Now don't forget cleanliness, or rather the medieval version of. Before each visit, women often doused themselves with rosewater or vinegar rinses. Not for hygiene exactly, but to mask the smell of sweat, candle smoke, and too many bodies pressed too closely for too long. Some brothels even required a foot wash before entering the room. Clients hated it, but the women insisted. After all, nothing kills the mood like gangrene toes. Down the hallway you see an older worker sitting on a stool, sewing her hem. She doesn't get many clients now, but she knows the rules better than anyone. She's the housekeeper, sometimes enforcer, and quietly feared by all. Rumor has it she once broke a man's wrist with a chamber pot. She nods as you pass. In another room, someone's crying. That happens too. Sometimes it's the client drunk and heartbroken, mourning a wife lost to plague or a lover married off to someone else. The women become counselors, priests, stand-ins for dead mothers or future wives. They pat backs, offer tissue and charge by the quarter hour. You're reminded that not everything here is transaction. Sometimes it's transformation. A chance to be vulnerable, to feel just briefly safe. But don't mistake intimacy for real connection. The women are professional. They smile, soothe, and gently extract payment before the mask slips. A little boy delivers food trays at the end of the hall. Stew, black bread, and a few sweet almonds wrapped in cloth. Workers eat in shifts between clients, never letting the makeup smudge too much, or the hairpins fall too far out of place. And yes, you guessed it, some brothels had dress codes. Simple linen shifts in municipal houses, or elaborate silks and gold-threaded bodices in elite ones. A uniform of desire, crafted for effect. One final door opens. Inside, a woman is reciting poetry softly, rhythmically, her voice wrapping around the lines like velvet. The man beside her is silent, just listening. She's not being paid to sleep with him tonight, just to speak, just to remind him that words can feel like touch when said right. And in that moment you realize something strange. There's more power here than downstairs, more ritual, more rules, more control. The women aren't just workers, they're art. They've memorized the unspoken choreography of want and created boundaries inside a world that rarely gives them any. You pause at the top of the stairs before heading back down, and you wonder, not for the first time, whether the men who climb up here really understand what they're paying for. Downstairs again, but your eyes now see the place differently. Behind every polished performance, behind each flirty joke and twirl of a hem, there's a set of unseen strings being pulled. And the person holding those strings? She's not in lace or lipstick. She's in boots, usually, and a long coat. Her hair's pinned back with precision, and when she walks through the brothel, the walls seem to lean aside for her. This is the or, depending on the time and place, the abbess, the manageress, the mistress of the house, or in a few winking registers, Mother Superior. She is the business. She decides who gets hired, how long they stay, what they wear, who they see, and perhaps most importantly, what they charge. She tracks coin like a royal accountant, and reads people with a glance. And if you're thinking she's some sort of medieval villainess, think again. You see, madams weren't always cruel profiteers. In many cases, they were former workers who had climbed the ranks. Some even bought the business from a retiring owner. A few inherited brothels from husbands, or from other women, in strangely touching wills scrawled on scraps of parchment. And yes, this is your mainstream historical fact. In 15th century London, several brothels in Southwark were legally owned and operated by women. Records show women like Elizabeth Morris and Alice Wade managing not just employees but property leases, court appearances, and in negotiations with church wardens. Boss babes, medieval edition. Being a madam meant enforcing discipline, managing competition, and at times doling out punishments. You break the rules? You're fined. You sneak a private client without sharing the cut. You're locked out for a week. You try to leave without paying debt. Good luck finding another place to work. And here's where things get juicy. Some madams were also informants. They kept local guards or clergy updated on shady clients or criminal dealings in exchange for protection or immunity. Historians still argue whether these alliances were practical arrangements or outright corruption. But either way, the madam usually came out on top. You watch one now leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, eyes sweeping the room like a chess player, eyeing the ball. She notices everything. That man who's lingered too long without paying. She nods to the bouncer. That girl whose shift should have ended an hour ago. She catches her wrist with a whisper, time to rest. The madam is not a mother, but she's not one either. She arranges for midwives when pregnancies happen. She lends money at harsh interest when dresses are torn or rent is due. She knows when someone's in love, and she can spot heartbreak faster than a priest spots sin. Here's a lesser known, slightly bizarre tidbit. In some French brothels, the madam kept a pet monkey or a tiny lapdog, not just as status symbols, but to entertain waiting clients and lighten the mood. Nothing says please relax and spend money like a monkey in a vest. Throwing razors. You catch the glint of keys on her belt. That's not for show. The madam literally controls the locks, rooms, cabinets, ledgers, exit doors. She's the gatekeeper. No one leaves without her knowing. You glance at her ledger, a thick, cracked book guarded like a dragon hoards gold. In signs, schedules, fines, debts, sometimes little notes, complains too much. Good singer, watch for pickpocket. It's less a register than a live social map of desire and danger. There's usually a second in command, a senior girl, often older, sometimes called the house mistress, or just the eye. She keeps order among the workers, checks rooms between clients, and handles the awkward conversations when someone gets sick or messes up. Then the muscle, the doorman or porter, big, quiet, scar-faced. He's there to make sure drunk nobles don't get grabby, that angry husbands don't storm upstairs, and that no one skips out on their time. And here's your historical oddity. In Venice and Florence, some of these guards were castrated ex-prisoners, safe around the girls, but still strong enough to bust heads if needed. Power in this house isn't simple. Some madams rule by fear, keeping girls in line with threats and fines. Others inspire strange loyalty. A few even act as matchmakers, helping women find clients they might someday marry. And yes, it happened. More than once, a regular client fell for a worker, offered marriage, and pulled her from the brothel. Sometimes it ended well, often it didn't, but the madam always collected a fee. Here's the deeper truth. Every brothel is its own small kingdom, and she's both queen and tax collector. She knows every whisper, every secret, every night someone cried into a stranger's chest and called it love. You listen as she speaks to a new girl. Her tone is firm but not cruel. She explains the rules, the schedule, the cuts, the expectation. She promises protection, but also demands obedience. There's an invisible contract being signed, and you, wandering through this world, realize that everything hinges on this unspoken balance between freedom and control, performance and protection, power and survival. One last look. The madam has returned to her post, sipping watered wine, pretending not to notice the chaos she orchestrates with a tilt of her chin. You might think she's cold, but if something goes wrong tonight, she'll be the first one out of her chair, ready to break the rules she wrote if it means protecting her house. You step aside as the door swings open again, and in walks tonight's latest visitor. He's not in armor or silks, no glowing halo or villain's mustache, just a tired face, dusty boots, and the faint whiff of horse sweat and incense. The kind of man you wouldn't look at twice at a market stall. And yet, here he is, coin in hand, ready to buy what the rest of the world says he shouldn't want. Welcome to the other half of the equation, the customers. The stereotype wants you to imagine a parade of sweaty nobles and drunken merchants. And sure, they're part of the clientele, but truthfully, the spectrum is wider and weirder than you think. Tonight's visitor, for instance, is a pilgrim, just arrived from Canterbury. He's been walking for days, praying at every wayside shrine, doing his penance with blistered feet. But after dinner and confession, he took a different kind of detour. Funny, isn't it? how the soul seeks redemption and pleasure in the same city square. That's your mainstream fact. Brothels in medieval pilgrimage cities like Avignon, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem, boomed during holy seasons. Religious fervor and physical exhaustion made a potent mix, and sinful temptations often found waiting rooms within walking distance of sacred relics. Pilgrims were warned, signs were posted, priests preached fire and damnation, but still, the doors stayed open. And speaking of priests, they weren't just the ones wagging fingers. Some of them were regulars, not all of course, but enough that records from Paris, Florence and Cologne include tales of clerics caught in compromising positions, some even caught running brothels on the side. Historians still argue whether these cases were exaggerated slander or routine hypocrisy, but the ink's there, on court scrolls and confession ledgers, names blacked out with shaky strokes. Then there are the merchants, greasy-handed men with heavy purses and louder laughs. They walk in smelling of spices and spoiled meat, bargaining out of habit. They want to haggle, as if lust came with a return policy. You watch one complain about the linens, another asks if there's a discount for repeat customers, but the house always remembers that merchant who paid with clipped coin last week. He gets cold tea tonight. That cloth dealer who left a girl bruised. He finds the door locked when he returns. Now brace yourself, because the next man through the door is dressed too finely. Velvet sleeves, silver buttons, a ring shaped like a lion's head. He walks with the arrogance of someone who never hears no, and behind him trails a bored-looking scribe with a notepad. He's nobility, and that means trouble. When high-born men visit brothels, they expect more than company. They expect deference, control, entertainment. You watch as the madam greets him herself, voice syrupy but strained. She knows what he can get away with. If he breaks a rule, no guard will drag him out. If he refuses to pay, no court will take the brothel's side. Power walks differently here. And yet, not all aristocrats were tyrants. Some came with coin, respect, and an odd kind of awkwardness. There are stories of noble boys too scared to speak, whispering rehearsed compliments to women twice their age. Some came seeking comfort after battle. Others just wanted to feel normal for one night. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In 14th century Venice, a nobleman once commissioned a custom poem to be read aloud during his visit to a brothel. The topic? The mythical beauty of his favorite courtesan's ankle. She had them immortalized in the margins of the house ledger, next to a doodle of a goat. The range of visitors doesn't stop there. You have musicians, who sometimes pay in songs, actors looking for inspiration or a warm place to crash between gigs, out-of-town masons, guards, gamblers, even traveling physicians. Once, a dentist set up shop in the brothel for a week, pulling teeth between trysts. You even get women. Yes, that's your quirky twist tonight. Female clients were rare, but not unheard of. Some came out of curiosity, others sought what their arranged marriages denied them, and a few came with their husbands, as observers, participants, or quiet accomplices. Love and desire wore complicated costumes back then too. You hear a clatter near the stairs, a drunk man, arm around two girls laughing too loudly. He wants to play dice before getting down to business. The madam indulges him, not because he's charming, but because he's rich, or more accurately, owed by people who are rich. There's no perfect customer. They all come with baggage. Some literal, some emotional. You hear confessions here more often than in church. Men talk about their fathers, their fears, their failures. Some cry, some fall asleep mid-sentence. One man, last winter, came every night just to be held. He never took off his boot, just sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in silence and linen. This place isn't just a house of pleasure, it's a mirror. Everyone who walks in sees something different, and reflects something they rarely show elsewhere. You take one last look around the room. There's a mason whispering sweet nothings he stole from a troubadour's song, a scribe scribbling verses on his palm, a knight staring out the window, armor unbuckled, face unreadable, and that priest again, murmuring something you hope is Latin. You think, this isn't just a gallery of lust, it's a living catalogue of human craving, not always noble, rarely simple, but always real. And outside, more footsteps on the cobbles. The night is far from over. The front door slams harder than it should. That sound, wood on wood, too sharp, too sudden, is never a good sign. You pause. So does everyone else. Even the lute player in the corner stops mid-chord. Eyes wide, The law has arrived. Now don't picture a grand army of armored knights. Most times it's just 2 or 3 men from the city guard, boots thick with alley grime and hands already twitching near their belts. One holds a scroll, the other holds a lantern. The third, if he's feeling theatrical, holds a club. This is a raid, but not the righteous, dramatic kind. This is more like theatre, crossed with routine. The brothel isn't shocked. It's annoyed and prepared. You see, brothels in the Middle Ages were not always illegal, but they were perpetually inconvenient, tolerated by city councils, but frowned upon by bishops, licensed in one district, banned in the next, and always under threat of a sudden crackdown when public morality or politics needed a scapegoat. Tonight's raid starts like most, a barked accusation, a hastily read edict about corrupting the youth, and a demand for names. The madam sighs. She's seen this play before. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval cities, brothels were technically state-sanctioned. Take 14th century London, for example. The stews of Southwark operated with royal approval, as long as they followed strict rules. No married women, no practicing on holy days, no enticing men from church steps. Break the rules, face fines, imprisonment, or closure. But here's the twist. Those fines often went straight into the city's treasury, so cracking down on brothels became a sort of civic fundraiser. Tonight's guards are here for a reason. Someone important, maybe a bishop, maybe a merchant, wants to make a point. A little virtue parade, if you will. So they strut around, poke their noses into rooms, sniff for scandal. But there's not much to find, because the madam has already moved the ledger. The girls who weren't licensed are suddenly just cousins visiting from Calais. The stronger wine is hidden. The client in the back room is, would you look at that, a visiting friar, offering last rite. Still, the guards need a trophy, so they seize a bottle, fine the house for noise after curfew, and threaten very gently to come back tomorrow, unless certain arrangements are made. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Paris, some guards were so regular in their fake raids that brothel owners kept special bribe baskets by the door, stuffed with coins, pies, and even hand-stitched gloves, payment for looking the other way. But not every raid ends with smirks and pastries. Sometimes it gets ugly. You remember the incident from 2 winters ago. A new bailiff, young, ambitious, desperate to prove himself, decided to make an example of the Red House on Rue des Fleurs. No warning, no bargaining, just 15 armed men crashing through the doors. They dragged girls into the street, smashed furniture, posted a city-wide edict by torchlight. The house was shut for a month, reopened quietly under a different name. Historians still argue whether these raids were about morals, politics, or simply money. Some say they were sincere attempts to curb vice. Others say they were designed to remind everyone who really held power in a city with few rules and many secrets. You watch as one of tonight's guards wanders toward the stairs, whistling. He finds a girl reading a book by candlelight, eyes him without flinching. He says something suggestive. She replies in Latin. He stares, blinks, and walks away. The law never quite knows what to do with smart women. Downstairs, negotiations begin. The madam and the lead guard sit across from each other, voices low and pleasant. A little fine here, a favor promised there. The guard asks for something from the cellar. The madam hands over a list, supplies she wants guarded on the next trade route. It's less a confrontation than a crooked handshake. You can see why reformers hated brothels. Not because of the sex, but because of the influence. These places were deeply networked. They knew which scribe was embezzling, which bishop had a lover, which merchant's son liked to dress like a nun. They heard whispers before the courts did. Power moved between silk sheets and behind curtain fold. And speaking of curtains, you glance toward the back parlor, where a different kind of deal is happening. That merchant from Bruges? He's offering gold to keep a scandal quiet. Something about a letter, a favor owed. He's not the first. The brothel keeps secrets, like banks keep coin. A soft thud upstairs. One of the guards has fallen asleep in the velvet chair. Another is helping himself to the stew in the kitchen. Raid over. Moral panic resolved for the evening. Tomorrow there might be another. A different pretext. A different fine. But tonight business resumes. The candles are relit. Music returns. Someone laughs too loudly, half with relief. And somewhere out in the cold, A priest preaches about purity to a crowd that knows better. You wake up with a scratchy throat, not ideal. Then you spot the faint rash along your wrist. Even less ideal. But this is medieval Europe. You're not the only one noticing strange lumps, itches, and lesions. In fact, you're surrounded by them. Hushed coughs behind velvet drapes, quick glances at spotted thighs, and panicked whispers about the boil. Let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval brothels were disease factories. It's not a surprise really. Close quarters, limited hygiene, rotating partners. And let's be honest, not a lot of latex innovation. You make your way to the kitchen, hoping someone there knows what this rash means. The cook eyes your wrist, raises one brow, and mutters something about vinegar. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Sexually transmitted infections were a well-known hazard in brothels, even back in the 1300s. The most infamous, of course, was syphilis, called the Great Pox, which swept through Europe like a scandal on horseback after 40. There were plenty of other suspects: gonorrhea, chlamydia, though unnamed, and a constellation of mysterious medieval conditions lumped under words like leprosy, the itch, or French fire. No, they didn't have modern diagnostics, but they did know something was wrong when a man's nose fell off. And here's a quirky tidbit. One of the common treatments for STIs in medieval brothels was, brace yourself, mercury. Yes, that mercury, slathered on sores, inhaled in vapors, even rubbed into the gums. Side effects included drooling, insanity, and death. But at least your rash stopped spreading, temporarily. Now, you might assume the church was constantly railing against this sinful pestilence. And sure, preachers loved a good fire and brimstone speech about the wages of lust, but the truth is messier. Some monasteries owned brothel properties, others quietly tolerated them, as long as confessions were made and penance paid. After all, a sinner who tithed was still a customer. Back in the brothel, the madam has her own system. Weekly inspections by an old woman nicknamed Goose-Eye Greta. Not a doctor, those were reserved for nobles, but a sharp-eyed midwife with a nose for infection and a deeply unsettling sense of humor. Greta's toolkit includes a candle, a copper mirror, and vinegar cloths. She's terrifying and surprisingly effective. You stand in line as she gestures to each girl, inspecting hands, eyes, mouths, and other areas with the briskness of someone who's done this 1,000 times. No small talk, just a grunt of approval, or a pointed cough that sends someone to the isolation room. Historians still argue whether brothels, like these, were healthier than unregulated sex work on the streets. Some say yes, they had rules, inspections, and basic hygiene. Others say no, the illusion of regulation simply masked a deeper, festering problem. After all, even the cleanest sheet can't protect you from a disease no one understands. But what about the clients? They arrive sweaty and smug, demanding the prettiest one, unaware or willfully blind to the risk. Some even bring their own herbs, stuffed into tiny leather pouches around their necks. Rue, wormwood, sage. The idea, protection through smell, as if a bad scent could chase away something worse than death. And speaking of scent, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? Well, it turns out medieval folk tried similar tricks for protection. Not crocodile this time, but crushed beetles, onion paste, and even wool soaked in vinegar, stuffed in unspeakable places. That's contraception and disease prevention in one, sort of. But perhaps the strangest part, the casual acceptance. Disease wasn't a surprise, it was a cost of doing business, like rain for a farmer, or fire for a baker. The madam keeps a ledger. One column lists earnings, the next illness days. She doesn't panic, she rotates the staff, quarantines the sick, and pays Greta in meat pies and soap. And when someone gets seriously ill, they disappear. Not in a sinister way, just, quietly, moved to a distant cousin's farm, or sent to a nunnery, where silence and herbs replace music and perfume. Sometimes they come back, sometimes not. You lie in bed that night, eyeing your wrist rash under moonlight. It hasn't spread, that's good. Your roommate snores softly, she's survived 2 rounds of the itch, and claims garlic is the answer to everything. You half believe her. Out in the hallway, someone coughs, a long rattling sound, then silence. The madam will light incense tomorrow, not because she thinks it works, but because it smells like control. You drift off, telling yourself it's probably nothing, probably. You're watching him from the upstairs window again. He walks briskly, cloak pulled high, head bowed, like someone trying not to be seen while walking into the most obvious building on the street. The bishop's ring glints faintly in the torchlight. Second visit this week. Of course he won't use the front entrance. He'll take the side gate, knock twice, wait for the latch. He'll slip inside, recite some half-hearted confession, and ask for the same girl, Bridget, with the dark hair and the slow smile. They always want the quiet ones. Downstairs, the parlour smells of wet stone and beeswax. Two girls sit darning their stockings, and the madam flips through her ledger with a soft sigh. Another nobleman booked for Thursday. She makes a note to triple wash the sheets. Those types always leave stains and gossip. Let's talk about this. The performance of morality. Because brothels didn't just survive in medieval society, they were often entangled with it, hidden behind a tapestry of double standards, secrets, and quiet arrangement. Your mainstream historical fact. Many brothels were protected and frequented by the very same elites who publicly denounced them. City leaders, clergy, scholars. Some even used brothels for political intelligence gathering or clandestine meeting. A whorehouse could double as a spy ring if the madam had the right ears. Remember the Venetian cortigiano Anste, the honest courtesans. They weren't just beautiful. They were literate, musical, and often more educated than the men they entertained. They read Latin, played lute, discussed Cicero between courses of honeyed almonds and flirtation, and yet publicly they were still fallen. It's not just hypocrisy, it's structural. The church condemned fornication, but accepted income from brothel tax. Confessors warned against lust, then wandered in after vespers, muttering something about pastoral outreach. Even the crown couldn't resist. In France, the royal court maintained a list of preferred establishments, discreet, well-staffed, and politically useful. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of Germany, brothel workers were actually required by law to wear specific colors or striped garments, like social camouflage. But get this, noblemen found the outfits titillating. What was meant to shame became its own strange fashion statement. Nothing like eroticizing your own oppression. Back upstairs you braid your hair, listening to the creak of the stairs. Someone's coming. The rhythm of the footsteps says it's not a customer, it's one of the city clerks. He'll deliver the new health codes, inspect the kitchen, and leave with a sly wink and an apple tart. He used to be married to a girl here, still sends her candles on St. Agnes Day. Historians still argue whether medieval sex workers had more agency than we assume. Some say yes. These women navigated powerful circles, managed money, and understood their leverage in ways that made them early entrepreneurs. Others point to the violence, lack of choice, and exploitative systems as evidence of deep-rooted injustice. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in the tangle. You walk past Bridget's room, her door is cracked open. Inside, the bishop is kneeling, fully clothed, face buried in his hands. She's reading something to him in Latin. Her voice is gentle, almost maternal. A prayer? A poem? You don't ask. The moment passes, private and strange. Downstairs again, you pass the kitchen. Greta is peeling onions. She hums a funeral song, but only because she claims it keeps the garlic potent. The girls are discussing politics. One of them swears she saw the Duke in the apothecary, buying powdered oyster shells. Another says she's saving to open a spice stall near the harbour. One day, when her sister returns, when her lungs clear, when the winter ends, you sit near the fire, warming your hand. The bishop leaves through the back. No eye contact, no goodbye. But he'll be back. Someone always is. It's not the secrecy that wears on you. It's the repetition, the need to act as surprised each time, to pretend this visit is different, to smile like it's sacred or new. But you get good at it. You learn their habits. You know which knights want lullabies and which bakers want arguments, which scholars want silence, and which widowers want laughter. And you know which lies to tell. He calls you beautiful. You say, he says this never happened. You say, of course, tomorrow you'll clean the room, wash the linens, refill the oil lamps, and maybe, just maybe, find a few coins hidden under the pillow. Payment, or apology, or both. You tuck them into your pouch, alongside your saint medal and the dried rose from last spring. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. Somewhere bells toll midnight. Inside, the secrets keep piling up like receipts or confessions. It's nearly dawn now. Not the kind that splashes gold and hope across cathedral windows. No, this is the quiet, bluish kind. The in-between light. Everything outside is soft-edged and uncertain, as if the world itself hasn't fully decided to wake up. Inside, you're folding sheets with one hand and holding a cup of something bitter with the other. The last candle flickers beside you, a stubby reminder that tonight is nearly spent. You glance at the door, still latched. No last-minute visitors. That's something. You always knew the end of the night was the most honest part. After the customers vanish, after the wine is hidden, after the perfume has faded, and the laughter has stopped echoing off stone, what's left are the bodies, tired, hungry, sometimes bruised. The women kick off their slippers, unpin their hair, and finally exhale. Your mainstream historical fact: most medieval brothels had official closing times, often enforced by curfew bells. Once night watchmen made their rounds, anyone caught loitering too long near a house of ill fame might be fined or worse. Brothels were tolerated, not embraced, like rats in a grain silo, better controlled than left to wander. You pour the basin of used water out the back window, into the alley's stone drain. It steams as it hits the cold. You think of the bishop's face, folded with guilt, of Bridgette's calm voice, of the city clerk and his apple tart, of the girl upstairs with the bruises she keeps naming after saints. Then there's the madam, sitting at her desk with a velvet pouch of coins. She hums while she counts. Not a bawdy tune, something older, sadder. You suspect it's a lullaby from when she still had a real name. Here's your quirky tidbit. In late medieval Paris, brothel girls were given special exemption from public whipping laws, unless they solicited too close to churches. The limit, 60 paces. One historian joked they measured it with rosary beads. A pot clinks in the kitchen. One of the girls is already boiling barley for the morning stew. Another is asleep on a bench, cheek pressed to her own arm like a child. You lean against the doorway, watching them. This house, for all its wear and whispered shame, functions. It feeds people. It shelters them. It gives some the illusion of intimacy and others the tools for survival. You've seen women come here with nothing and leave with small fortunes. You've seen others leave in silence, heads bowed, dreams shattered like dropped glass. Historians still argue whether brothels were more exploitative or liberating. Were they prisons, or were they loopholes in a world that offered women few exits? And what does liberation mean when you still have to smile on command? You can't answer that, but you can tighten a bandage, share a joke, set a place at the table. You can light a lamp for the next girl who comes in cold, hungry, and half hoping you'll turn her away. You never do. The candle gutted out 10 minutes ago, but you hadn't noticed, just the faint curl of smoke left behind. Greta swears the bakery down the lane has day-old bread if you arrive early enough. You think you'll try, maybe bring back some for the girl who hums in her sleep. Maybe not tell anyone it was free. You step outside. The air is sharp and clean, the kind that stings your nostrils but wakes your brain. You pull your shawl tighter and walk toward the edge of the square. The stones are damp with frost. The taverns are silent. A drunk sleeps near a fountain, snoring gently into a puddle of wine and regrets. Someone stirs behind you. A window opens. Another day beginning, another night ended, and despite everything, you're still here. You lived through it. You endured the secrets, and the whispers, the ink-stained records, and the unpaid debts, the velvet cloaks and bloodied handkerchiefs, the fake names and real tears. You stayed. And tomorrow, when someone new knocks at the side gate, lost, desperate, trembling, you'll let them in, offer them tea, ask their name, lend them a fresh shift. You'll tell them, it's not what you expected, and you'll mean that. And now, your legs are tired, your breath is even, and your heart, for once, doesn't. It's the perfect time to let go of the past and drift into something softer. Let's ease into that now. And now, with the final shutter latched, and the last whisper faded into stone, you let your eyes grow heavy, your breath softens, your limbs sink, and that last flicker of candlelight from the brothel's hearth curls upward into the shadows. Out there, the city is waking, but in here, You're wrapped in the quiet aftermath of memory, the perfume of old wood and warm linen, the hush of steps on stone, the gentle crack of a drying floorboard. It's safe now. There's no rush. The voices from earlier have gone silent. They've said what they needed to say. The bishop, the madam, the courtesan, with a sly laugh. They all recede into the glow of imagination, like figures stepping backward through a foggy doorway. You made it to the end, through alleys and arguments, secrets and candlelight, bruises and ballads, and now you rest. Let that soft breath escape. Let the last trace of tension melt from your shoulders. There's nothing else you need to hold. The story has closed its cover. The house has gone quiet. You're warm. You're safe. You're done.